There has never been a better time in human history to draft best ball teams than right now. The contests are bigger and better than they've ever been. The action is absolutely flying. I'm Peter Overzet, and today I'm going to spill all the secrets on how to win $1,000,001 on Underdog Fantasy this summer, compliments of all of the great research that's been done here at ETR. All right, let's do it. 10 best ball tips and tricks. Number 1, keep stacking. Now, I know stacking feels almost vanilla at this point, but it's important to drive home just how important stacking is to win these large field best ball tournaments in the same way it's important to win a DFS tournament. Noted nerd and individual who pays others to mow his lawn, Mike Leone,
I'm tired of this, Grandpa.
That's too damn bad!
looked at the win rates from last year and noticed that not only should we be stacking both of our QBs, but we should also be doing it with multiple pass catchers when possible. Here's the rub though. You don't need to reach for these stacks.
You reach, I teach.
Not only does it hurt your win rates, but it prevents you from getting the player you're targeting in the stack at a much cheaper cost and creating a monster team. I recently passed on Justin Herbert at pick 77 on a team where I had Keenan Allen. Was it hard? Yes. Did it take a lot of restraint? Yes. But like the Stanford marshmallow experiment, I was still able to get Herbert at pick 92 and my patience was rewarded.
You can have both.
One other note on stacking is that it is completely okay to stack without the QB, even though that sounds counterintuitive. Last year in the Underdog Best Ball Mania playoffs, there were tons of teams that had Ryan Tannehill and Derrick Henry on the same team. Even though there wasn't direct correlation, that team was succeeding and so were those picks in tandem. For this year, Leone has written up the Bengals as one of his favorite stacks, and I've drafted multiple Bengals pass catchers without Joe Burrow many times, and I promise you, it is okay. Tip number 2, build around optimal constructions. On Underdog, there are 18 roster spots. We have 1 quarterback, 2 running backs, 3 wide receivers, 1 tight end, 1 flex, and 10 bench spots. Now, there's no one perfect construction. Every draft is different. Every draft is a unique snowflake. But the win rates from last year can point us in the right direction as far as what is optimal and what has worked in the past. Funny enough, ETR's Justin Herbert won last year's Best Ball Mania tournament with a 3.942 construction, which actually had pretty awful win rates. But as you can see from this chart here, the constructions that yielded the most league victories were 2 QBs, 4 running backs, 9 to 10 wide receivers, and 2 to 3 tight ends. The big takeaways from this data for me is that when possible, we only want to be taking 2 players from the 1Z positions, quarterback and tight end, and drafting a limited amount of running backs so we can use those extra roster spots on wide receivers. This is specifically relevant if you take a quarterback or tight end early. Use that as permission to only take 1 more much later in the draft and use that extra roster spot elsewhere. Tip number 3, you can't draft running backs early and often. Let me say that again. You can't draft running backs both early and often. It's one or the other. The biggest mistake you can make in your best ball draft is taking too many running backs. And that's especially important right now where running backs are falling. They often look like the best value on the board. But the top 5 win rates last year were either 0 RB, hyper fragile RB, or single elite RB / modified 0 RB / bell cow RB / hero RB / whatever the hell you want to call it. Now let's break down these 3 different running back strategies. So hyper fragile, which is the strategy Justin Herbert employed to win Best Ball Mania last year, dictates that we draft running backs early, no more than 4 of them, and then we make up for our lack of wide receivers later in the draft with volume. 0 RB, on the other hand, allows you to maximize wide receivers, pass catchers, even quarterbacks in the early rounds while piecing together the running back position later in the draft. 0 RB strategy was not employed a ton last year, but look at this data. They absolutely smashed when they were used. Not to brag, actually, this is entirely to brag. I finished 5th in the other Underdog $5 Big Best Ball tournament last year with a true 0 RB team. I didn't take Kareem Hunt until the 6th round, finished in 5th place. It is possible, folks. I promise you. You can succeed with 0 RB. Single elite RB, or whatever you want to call it, relax. kind of splits the difference of the hyper fragile and the zero running back, where you take one elite running back early and then you ignore the running back position for a long time. Every iteration of a 4 running back build with 1 running back early resulted in an expected win rate above average last year. It's a very effective strategy. The one big similarity of all 3 of these running back strategies is they avoid the trap running backs in rounds 3 through 7, where wide receivers historically outscore the running backs by a significant margin. You can take a look at it here on this chart, compliment to Jack Miller. Now, what kind of running backs do you take in 0 running back builds? When you make these selections, you want a mixture of the various archetypes that serve specific purposes. Immediate production, think Raheem Mostert or James Conner this year. TD equity in a good offense, think Latavius Murray. High-end handcuff upside. I love you so much, Tony Pollard. Please let this year be the year. And receiving production like Gio Bernard and yes, James White, I see you in every draft staring into my soul until I select you. Of all of these archetypes of running backs, it's actually been the pass-catching running backs that have showed the highest win rates and yielded the most points above expectation. As you can see, I'm obsessed with drafting these kind of running backs, especially when I start my drafts heavy on wide receivers and tight ends. These 4 represent my 4 highest owned running backs through 100+ drafts this summer on Underdog. Although looking at it now, that's way too much money on Devin Singletary. Tip number 4, don't be afraid to go late round QB. Leone recently wrote a great article on ETR about why late round QB is particularly positioned to smash in 2021. For starters, we have intriguing QBs and ascending second-year QBs like Joe Burrow and Jalen Hurts, and this has injected the position with more upside and depth than we normally have. Specifically, these rookie QBs could be the skeleton key to unlocking high upside best ball teams this year. Trey Lance, Justin Fields, Trevor Lawrence, all are going after pick 120 on Underdog. Another reason to go late round QB is that there's a huge opportunity cost to taking these quarterbacks in the early rounds. You essentially have to pass up on an awesome wide receiver to get your elite quarterback. And then what happens is the wide receiver depth dries up and you're left chasing subpar wide receivers to round out your roster. We all love Lamar Jackson, but to select him, you have to pass on promising second-year breakout wide receivers like Brandon Ayuk, like Chase Claypool. A 2v2 you might run into is taking Ayuk and Trey Lance later versus grabbing Lamar Jackson and a guy like Marvin Jones later in the draft. Give me the Niners side of that 2v2 every time. Tip number 5. Be contrarian with the last picks in your draft. It's harder to be contrarian in best ball than in DFS, where the top 160, 180 players are going to be owned across every draft, but it is possible. As Herzig notes in one of his ETR pieces, the key is finding players that are rarely being drafted at all. That way, if the contrarian player ends up having a big season, not only will he help you win the regular season, but when it comes to the playoffs, you'll have a unique contrarian player relative to the field. Last year, league winners like Mike Davis, who was taken in less than 10% of drafts, and James Robinson, who was taken in less than 1% of drafts, were not only individual league winners because of their raw points, but they were also massive playoff contrarian plays because they weren't owned by the rest of the field. People get super anchored to the ADP on Underdog. They don't want to reach for a guy that's not at the top of the queue, but at the end of the draft, all of these guys are relatively low probability bets, so might as well differentiate with a guy that the rest of the field isn't going to have at the same rate. It's the same exact logic of why we don't want to play a chalky $3,000 wide receiver on DraftKings and DFS. There's a high likelihood he busts, so we might as well take a stab on a $3,000 wide receiver that isn't owned by the field so we can profit more when we are correct. Number 6, keep an eye on the NFL schedule. As best ball guys will remind you, if you really think about it, weeks 15 through 17 are basically 3 uncorrelated tournaments. So to win the $1,000,001, you essentially have to win your league, then win 2 small tournaments, and then win 1 big tournament. Getting to the dance is extremely important, but you have to give yourself a realistic shot of actually winning $1,000,001 when you get there. I personally like drafting with the schedule chart alongside me. I actually sleep with it at night too. I keep it hidden underneath my pillow. And I do this when I'm drafting so that I can break ties in favor of these shootout games in the playoff weeks. It allows us to get less individual things right and just identify the cohort of games where we think a lot of points are going to be scored. You can notice from the schedule here, which you can actually find in Jack Miller's article about the playoff schedule on ETR, that the teams with the best schedule as it pertains to potential shootouts is Kansas City, San Francisco, Arizona, and Detroit. Now, even your uncle who keeps asking you about Bitcoin, he's now hip to this week 17 shootout with Arizona and Dallas, but it's worth paying attention to the week 15 and week 16 matchups as well. Another way to try to identify teams with great playoff schedules is to use the Vegas totals. They've done implied team totals for every single game, figure out what the average is, and then see which teams have an implied team total much greater than the average across the league. I know that sounds exhausting, but thankfully, boy wonder, Jack Miller did this work for us, even though I don't think he's old enough to even place a bet or have a drink. But once again, we can see from this analysis some familiar team names along with Tampa Bay, Indiana, and Dallas as teams with very favorable playoff schedules. Tip number 7. Don't play it safe. Draft like you are correct. Look, everyone wants to be able to post a screenshot of their team on Twitter and avoid any criticism whatsoever.
Did you consider drafting more running backs early in the draft? Because that's where you're weak. You're strong on receiver. You're weak at running back. I love the receivers. I don't love the running backs.
Here's the thing though, the hyper-fragile teams, the zero RB teams, they're not gonna look great in July. You just aren't going to win a screenshot beauty contest in the middle of the summer. When you draft teams, you're drafting to post the screenshot in January, the one that can win it all, and everyone goes, how did you think to draft to that guy? How did you do that? That's what we're trying to do. Here's a few ways to ensure that you're not putting on 3 condoms when you draft. Don't draft that third QB or tight end after selecting an elite guy. Don't draft a running back's handcuff. Don't prioritize average projected points over potential upside. Don't draft well-balanced roster builds. Don't avoid targeting talented players in ambiguous situations. Don't draft veterans with a secure role but capped upside. I'm looking at you, AJ Green. And most of all, don't drink and draft. I promise, it's not worth it. Although I guess that would be not playing it safe. Whatever, do what you want. The main thought experiment to have when wondering, am I playing it safe, is if I'm correct in these assumptions, then what? If you take Cam Akers and Joe Mixon with your first 2 picks, you need to work under the assumption that they're gonna stay healthy and they're gonna be top 5 running backs. Well, what if they aren't, Pete? What if they get hurt? I need more running backs. I don't even know what voice that was. Well, newsflash, you weren't gonna win your league anyways, so don't play for the friendliest loss. Tip number 8, recognize the new meta in the changing landscape in these Underdog Best Ball drafts. Now, what if I told you that some of these tips and tricks that I'm sharing today are already being adopted by the players on Underdog Fantasy? ETR has been looking at the ADP movements, and just in this past week, within the top 100 picks, the top 30 risers were all wide receivers, and the top 20 fallers in ADP were all running backs. Everyone is getting hip to how important wide receivers are in these drafts. Hyper fragile strategy is all the rage as everyone copies Justin's homework, and the running back dead zone is being obliterated. Of all the strategies we discussed, zero RB is quite possibly the final frontier of an optimal draft strategy that isn't being used by the field a ton. I like flipping the script on my opponents who are often drafting a couple running backs early by grabbing a couple pass catchers, maybe even a tight end early. This can work out in a couple of ways. One, because the running backs are now falling, you can actually get higher quality running backs in rounds 8, rounds 9, rounds 10 than you used to before. And on the flip side, the running back earlier teams are going to have a harder time making up for their lack of wide receiver firepower because all the wide receivers are also getting pushed up and gobbled up by the zero RB drafters. Nothing makes me more happy than taking my 8th wide receiver through 10 rounds and whispering to myself, no wide receivers for you. Number 9, Get draft reps. The best way to get good at these drafts, knowing how to navigate them, is doing a ton of drafts. The $5 tournaments on Underdog make this extremely easy to do. Not only does it allow you to get familiar with the ADP, the value pockets of the draft, how different draft slots impact the type of players that are available to you later in the draft, it also just helps you stay more patient and not reach for players. It's just easier to have patience when you know you're building a portfolio and you're gonna draft a ton of teams. As much as I love Laviska Shenault, and don't let anyone tell you otherwise, I'm not gonna reach for him ahead of ADP because I know in the next couple of drafts, he's gonna either fall to ADP or fall beyond ADP, and I can continue to get my Laviska shares at a palatable price. If you're continually reaching for players, other teams are gonna have that same cohort, but at better prices, and then you're just playing behind the 8 ball. If you don't have 45 minutes to an hour to carve out for the fast drafts, I highly recommend doing the slow drafts where you have up to 8 to 10 hours to make a pick. Some people say they hate the slow drafts, but the key is to be in so many of them at the same time that you're never not on the clock. I actually need to wrap up this video because I'm on the clock in 6 drafts right now. Number 10 in our final tip is take advantage of the daily updated Underdog ranks on ETR that you can easily export and upload directly to Underdog. Leone and the team at ETR are doing all of the heavy lifting for you. All you have to do, go to the rankings, download the CSV, go over to the rankings portion on Underdog, upload that there, and you'll have updated ranks whenever you go into the draft room. This is going to come in particularly handy once training camp starts, once preseason starts. The news is going to shift these ADPs. ETR will be on top of these movement shifts, and you can get ahead of your opponents who are still drafting off of stale ADP. All right, guys, that's it. 10 tips and tricks to win $1 million. Subscribe to the channel down below if you haven't. Use promo code ETR when you're signing up at Underdog, and we will see you in those best ball streets.